There is a very specific kind of emotional shock that happens when you haven't heard from him for months, complete silence, no messages, no calls, no real presence, and then suddenly he appears again, a text, a call, a simple reaction, maybe even just a quiet view that tells you he has been watching from a distance all along. And in that moment, something inside you shifts before you even have time to think. Your heart reacts first, your mind follows, and suddenly everything you thought you had left behind feels active again. Before you respond, before you decide anything, you need to understand what is actually happening here. Not through fear, not through hope, but through psychological reality. Because what you are feeling right now is not weakness. It is not regression. It is your nervous system responding to a real emotional imprint that never fully disappeared. When a meaningful emotional connection forms between two people, the brain does not simply erase it, because communication stops. Human attachment does not work like a switch that turns off. It stays stored in memory, in emotional conditioning, even in the body's response patterns. That is why a sudden return can feel overwhelming. It reactivates something that was never fully closed. You are not starting from zero again. You are re-entering something your system already recognizes. This is not imagination. It is how emotional bonding works, and this is why his return feels heavier than just a message. It carries history, memory, and unresolved emotional weight all at once, and your body recognizes it instantly, before logic can even respond. One of the most important psychological reasons a man returns after months of silence is something deeply humbling. When he walked away, he likely created a version of reality in his mind, where distance would feel easier over time, where moving on would feel natural, where silence would slowly turn into peace. But reality rarely matches emotional assumptions. Over time, life without that connection begins to feel different than expected, not always worse in an obvious way, but emptier in subtle ways. This is called comparison pressure in psychology. Every new experience, every new interaction, every new emotional possibility gets unconsciously compared to what he once had with you. And when nothing fully matches that emotional depth, the mind begins to revisit the original connection, not because it is forced, but because it becomes the internal reference point. There is also a deeper neurological layer that most people never consider. Emotional bonds are not only psychological, they are biological. When two people form a real attachment, the brain releases bonding chemicals that shape neural pathways around familiarity, comfort, and emotional reward. These pathways do not disappear just because time passes. They remain stored in the nervous system, quiet but intact, and what brings them back is not always a big emotional event. Sometimes it is something very ordinary, a certain sound, a specific mood, a moment of loneliness, or even a random memory triggered without intention. And suddenly, the emotional imprint of you becomes active again. It does not feel like a decision. It feels like a pull, a return that his logic did not fully plan. Another reason behind his return is something more emotionally uncomfortable. Absence brings clarity, but only after detachment fails. During distance, a man may try to convince himself that moving on was the right choice. He may distract himself, explore new connections, or try to normalize life without you. But over time, emotional substitution often fails. What you gave was not generic, it was specific. Your attention, your presence, your emotional tone, the way you made him feel understood in a certain way, it is not easily replaced. And when that realization slowly settles in, it creates emotional contrast. Not dramatic regret at first, but a quiet recognition that something meaningful is missing. That recognition is often what brings him back, not as a sudden decision, but as a slow emotional correction. There is also unfinished emotional business. Situations that ended without full clarity, conversations that never happened, words that were never spoken, emotions that were never fully expressed. These unresolved endings do not disappear with time. They remain active in the background of the mind. And psychologically, the brain seeks resolution. It wants emotional closure. When closure is missing, the mind revisits the source. That is why after long silence, a return often happens. Not always because everything is resolved, but because something inside him still feels incomplete. And now he is trying, consciously or unconsciously, to find closure through reconnection. At the same time, not every return is driven by deep emotional reflection. Some returns come from personal growth, or emotional awakening. Distance sometimes forces self-awareness. Being alone with consequences, sitting with silence, and experiencing life without emotional access can lead to reflection. In some cases, a man realizes he did not fully understand what he had until it was gone, and in that space, emotional maturity can develop. Not always perfectly, not always completely, but enough to shift behavior. And if his return feels different, more grounded, more accountable, less reactive, that is something that deserves observation, not immediate rejection or immediate acceptance, but awareness. What matters most right now is not choosing a reaction. It is understanding the meaning behind the return without rushing into interpretation. Because your nervous system is activated, your emotions are active, and your memory is awake. But clarity does not come from intensity. It comes from distance and observation. The fact that he returned does not automatically mean he has changed, and it does not automatically mean he hasn't. It simply means something inside him reconnected to something he once had access to. What you decide next should not come from emotional shock, but from emotional clarity. And here is the most important truth in all of this. His return is not a measure of your worth. It is not validation of your value, and it is not proof that you needed him. It is only proof that the connection had an impact. Nothing more, nothing less. You were not forgotten because you were insignificant. You were absent because life moved forward in separate directions. And now that he has returned, you are being given a moment of choice, not a confirmation of need. You were never less valuable during the silence. You were not waiting to become enough. You were already complete in your own worth. His absence never reduced you, and his return does not increase you. What it does reveal is how deeply something real was experienced. But real does not always mean right. Real does not always mean permanent. And real does not always mean mutual in the same way at the same time. So when you decide what to do next, whether to respond, observe, or walk away, let it come from clarity, not emotional reactivation. Let it come from your awareness, not your attachment. Because you are not here to be retrieved when convenient. You are not here to be returned to when everything else fails. You are here to be chosen clearly, consistently, and without silence in between. And once you truly understand that, his return stops being the question. Your peace becomes the answer. There is a very specific kind of emotional shock that happens when months of silence are suddenly broken by a message, a call, or even a small quiet sign that he has been there watching from a distance all along. In that instant, something inside you reacts before you can even think. Your body responds faster than your logic. Your heart remembers before your mind can protect you. And now everything you thought you had moved on from suddenly feels alive again. Before you respond, before you make any decision, you need to understand what is actually happening beneath the surface, because what you are feeling is not confusion and it is not weakness. It is your nervous system reacting to a real emotional bond that was formed over time and never fully dissolved. There is a very specific kind of emotional shock that hits when months of complete silence are suddenly broken by a message, a call, or even a small sign that he has been there in the background all along. No warning, no gradual easing into it. Just one moment of stillness, and then suddenly your phone lights up, or you see his name, or you realize he has been quietly watching from a distance. And in that instant, something inside you reacts before you even get the chance to think. Your body responds first. Your emotions follow immediately. Your thoughts try to catch up afterward. And everything you thought you had left behind starts to feel alive again in a way that can be unsettling and overwhelming at the same time. Before you respond to anything, before you make any emotional decision, you need to understand what is actually happening inside you right now. Because what you are feeling is not weakness, and it is not a sign that you failed to move on. It is your nervous system reacting to a real emotional imprint that was formed over time and never fully erased. Human attachment does not disappear just because communication stops. The brain does not treat emotional bonds like temporary conversations that can be deleted. It stores them. It integrates them. It keeps them alive in memory, in habit, and in emotional response patterns that can reappear without warning when triggered again. That is why his return feels so intense. It is not just a message. It is a reactivation of something your system already recognizes. You are not meeting a new situation. You are stepping back into an emotional field that was already created between you. And that is why even something small feels big, because it carries not just words but history, familiarity, emotional conditioning, and unfinished energy all at once. Your reaction is not random. It is the natural response of a bond that never fully closed. One of the most important psychological truths behind his return is this. When he created silence, he likely believed it would lead to relief. In his mind, distance may have seemed like clarity, a way to simplify emotions, a way to reduce intensity, a way to move forward without complexity. At first, that illusion can feel real. Silence can feel like control. Absence can feel like freedom. But over time, the emotional mind does not stay aligned with that initial narrative. Life continues, but emotional memory also continues in the background. This is where psychological contrast begins to form. Every new experience he has, every new connection he explores, every attempt to move on is unconsciously measured against the emotional baseline you once represented. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in a quiet comparison that builds over time. The mind starts asking unspoken questions. Why does this not feel the same? Why does this not connect in the same way? Why does something still feel incomplete? And slowly, without force, the emotional memory of you becomes the reference point again. There is also a deeper biological process happening underneath all of this. Emotional bonds are not just thoughts or preferences. They are neurological imprints. When two people form a real emotional connection, the brain releases bonding chemicals that begin to link emotional safety, attraction, comfort, and familiarity to a specific person. Over time, these connections form neural pathways, and those pathways do not disappear just because time passes or communication stops. They remain stored in the nervous system, quiet but intact. What brings them back is not always something logical or planned. It can be something extremely subtle, a feeling of loneliness at the wrong time, a memory triggered by something unrelated, a moment of emotional vulnerability when defenses are low, or even just a pause in life where the mind naturally turns inward, and suddenly the emotional imprint of you becomes active again. And when that happens, it does not feel like he is making a decision. It feels like something inside him is pulling him back toward familiarity, toward emotional memory, toward what his system still recognizes as significant. Another powerful reason behind his return is emotional comparison failure. During the time apart, he may have genuinely tried to move on. He may have explored new connections, new environments, new emotional possibilities. At first, it might have felt like progress, distraction, even healing. But over time, something more subtle often begins to emerge. What you gave him was not easily replaceable. Not because you were perfect, but because the emotional experience you created had a specific depth and quality that is not easily replicated. And when that realization slowly builds, it creates emotional contrast. Not always regret in a loud way, but recognition in a quiet way. The understanding that certain emotional experiences are not interchangeable, that not every connection feels the same, that something meaningful is missing, even if everything on the surface looks fine. And this realization often does not come all at once. It accumulates, it lingers, it grows in the background until it eventually leads to a return. There is also unfinished emotional energy that plays a major role here. Conversations that were never fully completed, feelings that were never clearly expressed, situations that ended without closure. When emotional experiences end without resolution, the mind does not fully categorize them as complete. Instead, they remain open loops in the background, and the human brain naturally resists incomplete emotional endings. It seeks resolution, it seeks closure, even if that closure is delayed. So when he returns after months of silence, it is often not just about missing you in a simple sense. It is also about the mind trying to resolve something that was never fully processed, something that still feels open inside him, something that did not reach emotional completion. And that unresolved space often becomes the psychological reason for reappearance, even if he himself cannot fully explain it. In some cases, his return can also come from a place of awareness or internal change. Distance has a way of stripping away emotional noise. When someone is no longer inside the connection, they are forced to see it from the outside, and that shift in perspective can lead to realization. Not always perfect understanding, not always full maturity, but awareness that something meaningful was experienced and perhaps not fully valued in the moment. This is why his return may sometimes feel different, slightly more grounded, slightly more reflective, less impulsive, more careful, but even then, awareness alone is not enough. Understanding something emotionally is not the same as being able to sustain it in behavior. That difference is what you need to observe carefully, not just the return itself, but what follows after it. What matters most right now is not reacting immediately to the emotional shock of his return, because your system is activated, your memory is active, your emotional body is responding. And in this state, it is very easy to assign meaning too quickly. But meaning should not come from intensity, it should come from consistency over time. His return does not automatically mean change, and it does not automatically mean repetition of the past either. It simply opens a moment of observation. And here is the truth that sits beneath everything. His return is not proof that you needed him. It is not validation of your worth, and it is not evidence that you were incomplete without him. It is only proof that the emotional connection had impact. Nothing more, nothing less. You were not forgotten because you were unimportant. You were absent because life moved forward in different directions. And now you are standing in a space of choice, not emotional validation. You did not become more valuable when he returned. And you were never less valuable when he left. Your worth was never dependent on his presence, his absence, or his timing. It was always yours, constant, unchanged, independent of his actions. So whatever you choose next, whether you respond, observe, or step away completely, let it come from clarity, not emotional activation, because you are not here to be retrieved when convenient. You are not here to be revisited when it suits someone's emotional timing. You are here to be chosen clearly, consistently, and without confusion in between. And once you truly understand that, his return stops being the center of the story. Your peace becomes the center instead. When two people share a meaningful emotional connection, the brain does not delete it just because communication stops. Human attachment does not work like a simple on and off switch. It gets stored in emotional memory, in behavioral patterns, and even in physical responses that can reappear without warning. That is why a sudden return feels so intense. It is not a new situation. It is an old emotional pathway being reactivated. You are not starting over from nothing. You are stepping back into something your system already recognizes as significant. And this is why even a simple message can feel overwhelming. It is not just words. It is history, emotion, and unfinished energy all returning at once. One of the first psychological reasons he comes back after months of silence is something very important. When he created distance, he likely imagined that moving on would feel easier than it actually turned out to be. In his mind, silence may have seemed like relief, freedom, a clean break, a fresh start. But real emotional experience rarely matches imagined emotional escape. Over time, life without that connection begins to feel different in subtle ways. Not always painful in an obvious sense, but incomplete in a quiet way. This is where psychological contrast begins to form. Every new interaction, every new connection, every new emotional experience is unconsciously compared to what he once had with you. And when nothing quite matches the emotional depth, familiarity, or comfort you represented, the mind begins to circle back. There is also a deeper biological layer behind this that most people never think about. Emotional bonds are not just thoughts, they are chemical and neurological imprints. When a connection is formed, the brain releases bonding chemicals that begin to link emotional safety, attraction, and familiarity to a specific person. These neural pathways do not disappear just because time passes. They remain stored in the nervous system, waiting, and they can be reactivated by the smallest triggers: a memory, a place, a feeling of loneliness, a random moment of stillness. Suddenly the emotional imprint of you becomes active again. And when that happens, it does not feel like a decision. It feels like a pull, a return that happens before logic can explain it. Another powerful reason behind his return is emotional comparison failure. During the period of silence, he may have tried to move forward. He may have engaged with new people, new experiences, or new emotional possibilities. At first, it might have felt like progress, distraction, even relief. But over time, something often becomes clear. What you gave was not easily replaceable, not because you were perfect, but because the emotional dynamic you created was specific. The way you listened, the way you connected, the way you made him feel seen in a particular way cannot simply be recreated in a new situation. And when that realization slowly builds, it creates emotional contrast. Not always dramatic regret, but a quiet recognition that something meaningful is missing. There is also unfinished emotional energy. Conversations that never fully happened, words that were never spoken, feelings that were never clearly expressed. When a connection ends without full closure, the mind does not treat it as complete. It keeps it open in the background. This is why after long silence, a return often happens. Not always because everything is resolved, but because something inside still feels unfinished. The brain naturally seeks closure, even if the conscious mind tries to ignore it. And that need for resolution often brings people back to the source of the emotional loop, even after months of distance. In some cases, his return can also be linked to emotional awareness or personal change. Distance sometimes forces reflection. When a person is alone with their choices, without the comfort of your presence, they are faced with the emotional consequences of what they lost or stepped away from. This space can lead to realization, not always immediate transformation, but awareness. He may begin to see things he did not fully understand before. Not just about you, but about himself and how he handles connection. And sometimes that reflection leads to a different kind of return. One that feels less impulsive and more grounded, even if it is still uncertain. What is important right now is not rushing into interpretation, because your emotional system is already activated. Your memories are active, your feelings are active, and your mind will naturally try to assign meaning before clarity is fully present. But clarity does not come from emotional intensity. It comes from observation over time. The fact that he returned does not automatically mean he has changed, and it does not automatically mean he has not. It simply means something in him reconnected to something that once mattered. But here is the most important truth you need to hold on to. His return is not proof that you needed him. It is not validation of your worth. And it is not evidence that you were incomplete without him. It is only evidence that the connection had impact. Nothing more, nothing less. You were not forgotten because you were unimportant. You were absent because life moved forward in separate directions. And now that he has returned, you are standing at a point of choice, not validation. Your value was never created by his presence, and it was never reduced by his absence. You did not become more worthy because he came back. You were already worthy during the silence, during the distance, and before any message ever arrived. His silence was never a measure of your value. It was a reflection of his timing, his capacity, his emotional readiness, and his internal state, none of which define who you are. So whatever you choose next, whether you respond, observe, or step away completely, let it come from clarity, not emotional reactivation, because you are not here to be retrieved when convenient. You are not here to be revisited when everything else fails. You are here to be chosen clearly, consistently, and without confusion in between. And once you truly understand that, his return stops being the center of the story. Your peace becomes the center instead.